Hello, Bayo. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Thank you, brother, for having me.
Yeah. And the theme, of course, that we're exploring today is transformational learning. And the word transformation can mean different things to different people. So I thought a good place to start might be to really open up that definition. And I'd love to hear how you relate to that word, transformation.
Hmm. Well, not to go piecemeal on this, but I think the idea of shape shifting comes to mind. The 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 idea of a nomadicity, that is traveling, losing shape, losing form, and becoming otherwise, becoming other, becoming monster, becoming different, becoming non-legible comes to mind as some of the more radical notions of transformation that inspire me. I mean, the word is quite popular. We use it for everything. We talk about transformation this, and we promise transformation to people. We do a lot of transformational work. Lots of politicians are called transformational. Um, Business activities, transformational, entrepreneurial, transformational. So we use it a lot, but I want to stay true to something else. The not the idea of uh, just the new, you know, because the new could be a reiteration of the old. Um, uh, but but when something is crossed out by something else, so I'm thinking of the transversal, like a crossroads, when something travels across and upsets the logic of the previous. That feels
Mhm.
radical to me. Yeah.
Mm, I love that last point. Upsets the logic of the previous. So, how would you apply that in the context of learning? What is the previous logic that might get upset, and what is the transformation that might be available?
Well, okay, let's consider the idea of transformational learning. Um, a couple of considerations come to mind. One is the learner. Who is the learner,
Hmm.
right? What is the body of the learner? How do we designate the learner who is engaging or has engaged in transformational learning? Um, and then secondly, it's how do we know that transformation has happened or occurred?
Hmm.
How do we decide that? Well, this is psychology 101, right? It's learning is a change in behavior, right? So it situates learning to the organism, to the human person, right? And when there is some change, some significant alteration, change between some kind of previous behavior and subsequent behavior, then we say that transformation has occurred, learning has occurred, right? But maybe we just say learning has occurred. But I think in coupling transformation with learning together, other kinds of moves are desired here. And that's why I asked the first question, who is the learner, right? And is it possible that we bracket this gesture, this activity of reducing change or learning to the organism, to the behavior. So let's travel with this a little bit. I feel that the organism is ecological, right? I don't know how to isolate the item from its conditions of becoming or its being,
Hmm.
right? Um, I don't know how to think about Lorenz, for instance, apart from the politics that makes you possible, the architecture that makes you possible, the city that makes you possible, the furniture, the intensities, the densities, the thresholds that make you possible. You are a milieu, if you will. You are not an item within a milieu, right? So if you are
Mhm.
dispersed that way, if you're ecological, near atmospheric in that way, then is it possible that some squiggly organism in some place in this milieu that makes you possible, that a change or a dramatic shift in its patterns of behaving means that you are also learning differently? I'm trying to think through
Mm.
chaos here, right?
Mm.
Instead of isolating it to what Lawrence is doing in the moment, could we blast open doings, you know, and notice not the spider, but the web, not the occupants in the room, but the room itself? Is it possible that the notion of transformational learning guides us to a force field instead of the of you know objects within the field, right?
Mhm.
Is it possible that we start to think about learning in post-humanist ways? By post-humanist, for those who are not familiar with the term, I'm speaking about the gesture that decentralizes the human as the focus of learning, as the learner, as the item of concern, as the agential heart of learning,
Mhm.
right? Is it possible that if I tug on one aspect of the web, I have touched Lorenz, or I've touched the soul space, the soul horizon that is you, right? I'm just riffing here and thinking
Mhm.
along, and of course, what was my second question? I said, who's the learner, and how do we decide that learning has occurred? Maybe then, if we thought of bodies as large and diasporic and web-like and rhizomatic and arboreal, like trees with branches, maybe if we thought of learning as so subtle and crack-like that it travels like tensions in a super saturated solution. Maybe if we thought of learning as fine, then we wouldn't need to reduce it to human behavior. And maybe then learning is not always measurable. Maybe we're co-participating in fields where it's not always available how we're learning. Just like it's not always available how a baby comes to take on different gestures, right? Psychologists like to think that they know, but maybe how we know is getting in the way of what the world is actually doing, right? Maybe knowledge is actually what we designate as method or knowledge or rigorous study is actually a kind of carcerality that encloses or captures strenuously what the world is doing. So maybe learning is not always available for measurement in the ways that can be graded. Maybe behavior is not the only sensor that is alive to change. Um, and maybe we are learning in ways that are too much for our languages to
Mm.
detect.
I love um, the radicality of what you're suggesting, both in terms of what it means to be human and what it means to learn, which I think is really at the root of what we're exploring with this concept of transformation. And for me, two words come up. One is awareness. So there's
Oh, I've
our,
lost your voice
you've lost my
for
voice?
some reason.
Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
Okay.
It's
Um,
back. It's
it's
back.
back.
It's back.
Oh boy.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me exactly, but I will maybe repeat what I said. Did you hear the part I said about the radicality of what you suggested?
Yes, I did. I
Yeah.
did. I heard that.
So
Yes.
and so the radicality of what it means to be human and of what it means to learn.
Yes.
And for me, two words come up. One is awareness, and the predominant awareness right now, which is human-centric, and that I am the center of this experience.
Yes. Yes.
And um, and then the response that that awareness offers. So how I perceive myself to be, how I occur, how the world occurs to me,
Mm-hmm.
naturally inclines itself to a particular response.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is at the heart of what is being explored with transformational learning. I've
Mm-hmm.
heard you share that the way that we respond to a crisis is often part of the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious to hear your reflections on how our mainstream response to many of the things that are going on in the world is might be rooted in the way that we learn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For some strange reason, and maybe I might not do as much justice to this as I think I can, and maybe because my brain is still recovering from some jet lag, um, being the traveler, the frequent traveler that I am, um, twin studies came to mind. These are psychological explorations of twins,
Mm,
and especially estranged twins, twins that are estranged from birth. And the remarkable quality of similarity in their lives, right? After the fact of their birth, and knowing that they never interacted, but they later discovered each other, right? So I'm just going to think and paraphrase one of the most popular ones because I cannot remember the names of this, of one of the most shocking examples of this kind of epigenetic collaboration across distances, almost like a quantum field of
mm,
learning together, right? So these two twins, um, whose names I can't remember, but I'll call them John and James, have very were are twins. They're brothers, but they were estranged from birth at birth, and did not communicate with each other. But then discovered each other in adulthood, found out they had similar tastes, um, found out they married their wives with the same name. I'm just going to go with Laura. They both they
mm.
both liked Laura. They they bought the same kind of car, you know. I'm just gonna go with Volkswagen. Uh, they they uh, they like the same kind of food. Everything that seems to be learned, right? They kind of did, and they did separately, right? One explanation for this is that it's all in the genes. It's there. It's all in the genes. This form of behavior has been transcribed and written into the chemical body of these brothers. They are they're predetermined to do this, right? I don't think that quite adds up. In and I've not spent as much time looking through these studies, but on first glance, the way that I come to this is I don't know that I can reduce the world to some predetermined substrate, some foundationalism that informs everything else, right? I kind of feel that we're missing something that that cannot be reduced to, you know, culture and cannot be reduced to nature, right? In the ways that we often parse nature and culture apart, right?
Mm.
Nature or nurture apart. Is it nature? Is it predetermined? Or is it nurture? Is it learned behavior? There is a sense in which there is this ethereal, maybe I shouldn't use the word ethereal so that it doesn't come across as mystical, but there is this desirous flow that shapes things, um, from whence we cut out the chunks of matter that we call our knowledge, that we designate as predetermined behavior or as learning. And I'm going through this, I'm saying this. Other examples come to mind, like the electric face of a frog. And these might sound like bizarre words to you, but they're examples of how there seems to be a force field that exceeds us. And why I start by saying that the subject is a milieu, is a territory. I often say this, the Black Studies thinks about the human as a colonial territory instead of as the anthropomorphic shaped organisms that we are used to, right? We are territories of being and becoming. So that suggests to me then that how we carve out knowledge, how we know, is how we are met and how we meet others and how we meet the world. It's what we leave out and what we are left out of. It's how we navigate touch. It's how we greet each other. It's how we eat. All of that is wrapped up in a metaphysics, and an epistemology, a knowing together. It's how we frame morality and how we are shaped by morality, right? It's how we tamp down and cover up cracks and spillages or pathologize it, or it's how we leave them be, right? All these subtle rituals is how we shape and are shaped by the world. So your question then is, how do I read that with what I call post-activism? Post-activism, in my sense of the word or the term, and I formulated it, but I'm still learning about it in its formulation and its co-formulation, is this interruption of grace. And by grace, I mean when something disrupts our ways of learning, our ways of thinking, our ways of understanding the world and ourselves, when something gets in the way of that. So could it be that the ways that we think about the world or approach a crisis is part of the crisis? Yes. And that is definitely linked with how we learn, right? Because I've just tried to blast open how we learn, as not just us. It's not just what we are doing. It's how the world is breathing, right? It's how mountains are conducting research. It's how we learn is no longer an individual matter of our private interiorities or selves or memories. That's not, learning is, again, through twin studies, learning cannot be reduced to what my organism is doing. There are secret and invisible flows that supersede the individual organism and suggest to us that we are patterns instead of isolated individuals. We are patterns, right? So post-activism notices the patterns. It wants to stay with the patterns. It just doesn't want to tamp down or, extricate or exorcise the symptoms. It wants to enter into the patterns and dwell within the patterns and breathe within the patterns. So yes, brother, we're saying the same thing. Post-activism is about learning. Or rather, I would say it's about dislearning. It's about when something gets in the way of all the rituals that make us what we are and what we do at that moment.
The word that comes to mind is agency. And I think this is, as I listen to you, I feel like this is such a interesting double-sided word to explore, because in one sense, our kind of predominant Western form of education is all about agency, the agency to conquer matter, to radically simplify it in one way or another.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, with what you're sharing, the question that I sit with in this pattern model of the universe, is who am I, and what is my agency in that model, and
Mhm.
especially in the world of learning, even whether we're talking about me as a learner or me as a person who offers learning, whatever role that might look like as a quote unquote a
Mhm.
teacher. What, yeah, what does agency mean?
We often tether agency to, like a force of will to the individual, the ability to do, right? So, uh, we tie it to intention. So it's a form of intentionality. It's our choice. It's so I think when we popularly speak about agency, we're speaking about will and choice and human intentions. But brother, it seems very difficult to do that right now when you dislocate or decentralize the self and make the self, you dissipate it or you dissolve it into its environments. Not that you dismiss it, but that you can no longer think of the self as this isolated thing, that it's like a confluence of rivulets and streams coming to an applause of becoming, right? So um agency works when we think about it, given the imperatives of our post-humanist times. I think agency works when we think about it as distributed instead of unilateral. And that's why some scholars think about agency as affectivity. That is the capacity to be in response with, right? The capacity to be in response with. That speaks about a mutuality. It speaks about relationality more than just what I have, right? So there's something very possessive and almost evokes this notion of capitalist forms of ownership. When we say I have ownership, it cuts something out. It
Hmm.
leaves something out. I don't think we have agency, or agency is something to be had, right? Any more than um control is something to be had when you're rushing or when you're drowning in a fierce and rushing stream, right? Coming out of the water and saying, I have control. There's a sense, or I have this under control, or I have this river, right? There is not something to be have. We make I'll call it a mistake just for conversational purposes, but I mean much more than that. But we make the mistake of actually beginning from the individual that acts upon the world, and we don't notice how the world acts upon us. We don't notice
Hmm.
how we are acted upon, how we are impinged upon, how we are imprinted upon, how we are marked, how we're touched, how environments secrete us, how in the words of Michael Pollan, we're actually the dummies in an apple conspiracy. We're used by apples to spread themselves across the planet, right? The idea that our overlords are not Trumpian fascist figures, but our overlords are fruits, or that we're moved by viruses or microbes is intriguing and somewhat emancipatory for me. So I speak more of affectivity, being in response with. There's a
Hmm.
dialogic, more than dialogic corporeal process going on, or transcorporeal process going on. And we're constantly sharing blood. We're constantly navigating identity. We're constantly exchanging bodies, right? In more ways than our modern fixating with identity can actually notice.
Hmm.
I hope that makes
Yeah,
some sense.
yeah, and I love the maze that is offered in this exploration in a way, because it doesn't offer a straight path for conversation, and that's I find that welcome, because that's part of the unlearning and relearning. What's present for me is the noticing of what you're talking about, the noticing of that this thing that I call an I, the I construct, is and always has been a response to my environment. It has never existed outside of response. And
Yes.
so even this context of agency is always a response to an input. And that um, I think there's a lot to explore there. But in the context of learning and learning as a noticing of these things, how how do you think about approaching that? Because even, I mean, the reason I shared earlier that this is a bit of a tricky conversation because, you know, part of what is maybe occurring is an emergent process of how our society functions. And so even in the conversation of how we might reshape our learning system, you know, from a space of agency, it requires us to kind of notice where we are situated in that conversation.
Yes.
But nonetheless, here we are having the conversation about
Yes.
how we can shape learning experiences to invite a different kind of noticing and maybe a different understanding of the nature of knowledge.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that we're doing some very criminal work here. And I think
Did you
the
say criminal?
criminality, yes, I said criminal. The criminality of it is such that, or maybe I should say fugitive work. The fugitivity of it is that we are grasping and wrestling with edges, with
Mm,
usual borders, and we're not thinking within usual territories. And, there might be something unstable and coddie-wompling and childlike about it. But I think this kind of playful exploration is needed. Um, but I think it needs to be said, so you're asking me how do we notice? Maybe you repeat the question, brother, so I'll jump off of that.
yeah, you know, how do we begin to approach the way that we structure a learning experience specifically? Maybe we can start to get a little more specific here.
Yeah,
To invite the noticing of something different, of something new about our human experience.
right. Um, this might seem like a far out example, but maybe just one or two, just to resituate this diasporic quality that hopefully forces us to think along the lines of ecological co-learning, right? That if we reduce learning to isolated subjects, in much the same way that some therapeutic modalities reduce healing to the individual, something is lost, something is obscured. There are many African traditions, for instance, speaking about healing, that would think about not the individual that presents with symptoms. They would speak about communal issues and they would speak about ecological matters and they would speak about ancestral matters, right? I actually learned this while studying for my master's and PhD. Harmony restoration therapy comes from the eastern part of Nigeria. And I've just recently learned about something from Brazil called the integral communal therapy or something like that, where people, um, if you present with depression or addiction or something, it's not you, it's your
Mm,
community that is
mhm,
so learning is displaced from what you are doing to what your forms of relations, the assemblage that makes you possible. So this is not new. This is a sensibility, a sensitivity to the more than human. So maybe one example of this is, and I don't know why I like this example, but it just comes to mind and we can think with it. It may not have immediate bearings to our questions about learning, but I was intrigued recently by an article that noticed that in Mount Fuji in Japan, in the clouds that dip over that beautiful, aesthetically pleasing mountain, are microplastics, right? That and I forget the measure, but it was significant enough to cause an article to be written, right? That there are microplastics in this beautiful place, in this remote region. Think about it. Rain clouds have microplastics in them, right? This is what some scholars will call the Anthropocene. The the boundaries and the edges of the human are not limited to the forms we've taken. Although, in other words, the form that we have is much more than what is visibly present. It's not the person sitting in front of the screen that is the human. The human is a world of practice. They also found microplastics in a cave that had been shut off for decades, right? Um, they shut it out to keep it pristine and pure and away from human contamination. But then they opened it up recently and they found that plastics were already there in significant quantities, microplastics.
Mm.
I'm trying to blast open the body of the human and the body of learning as a result, that we are dispersed, we are everywhere, right? The human is the condition that makes the human possible. Um, and of course, with very practical, pragmatic considerations about learning, there is a sense I mean, this isn't new either. Ivan Illich had been writing about deschooling society. Many scholars notice that schooling kind of isolates us from learning, which is ironic. That when you put the child in a box, um, the child will become the box. The child, and I often tell people that, to think outside the box is exactly how boxes think, right? There's a sense in which our paradigms are not actually situated on, you know, learning per se. They are manufacturing citizens. They're manufacturing subjects, right? What kinds of embodiments call for more radical and more hospitable and more generative forms of co-learning with? See what I've done with learning? Learning can no longer be an isolated activity. Learning is always not transactional, but transcorporeal. It's always relational. Is it possible that we attend to those issues and those instigations within different kinds of environments that might be thought of as interrupting or disruptive, like the play of my autistic child, my son, um, who told us recently that I have everything I need and I don't want to learn from your books. I don't want to read a book because his mother and my wife and I were having some anxiety about when would you pick a book and read? And it was like, I don't need that now, right? In many settings that are more traditional and popular, he's not learning. He's deficit. There's something that needs to happen and we need to promote him. We need to include him. Um, and yet my son will enter into a room and discover patterns that would take me hours to find. He's immediately in touch. So this in touchness is what we're talking about here, that we're in touch. We're in touch with streams of emotion and affect and feeling and possibility that our modern conditioning doesn't know what to do with, right? Because it has already pre-designated us in boxes. So the more radical ecological transformational forms of learning look ecological to me. They have to break beyond the confines of traditional schooling. They have to do some other kind of work that allows us to recuperate or notice or stay with the trouble of the pathological, right? That even the things that don't fit into our paradigms or curricula is potentially generative, is, invitational. There's some hospitality there.
Yeah, I think this is really what I was also pointing at earlier when I said, how is the way that we respond to crisis rooted in the way we learn? And it's this conditioning of what we notice and what we value. And I think for me, it really opens up this question of, from this place where we have been conditioned to notice and value what we value, what is available to us then as a movement towards the shifting of that? Like how in maybe and maybe we can, I would love to hear any personal examples from your own pedagogical practice of teaching or shaping a learning experience. How how does your orientation in the thread of what we're exploring here um, serve to shape the way that you might participate in something called teaching?
Play. So
Did you say
play
play?
feels play, play.
Mm.
Play feels like and I'm talking about unsupervised, you know, radical play, like um children as researchers, for instance. Like we treat our children as philosophers. We think of them as,
You mean you and your family specifically?
yes, my family.
Mm.
Families,
Hmm.
sorry about that. My family,
Mm.
we think about our children as philosophers, as researchers. They're constantly, they're alchemists of some kind. Um, they're not just measuring a world that already is. And this is especially true in the case of my
Mm.
son, right? They are alchemizing worlds in how they touch it, in how they meet it. Children know how to do this, right? And I think we kind of grow out of it because we're told we should leave childish things behind, which is an unfortunate, in many degrees, an unfortunate invitation. Um, but my son, my son doesn't background the world with his autism. He doesn't know how to background a world as if the world were already made and we're just merely studying it or representing it. So he's always in play. He's always in play. And to be in play is to be blissfully lost sensorially in a world that is also awkward in how it comes to be, right? Play isn't possible if we conceptualize the world as already still, is made. That calls for seriousness because we want accuracy and precision, right? And our educational paradigms kind of mimic that serious approach. We need to capture the world as it really is. But it's almost impossible for my son because he doesn't background the world that way. He doesn't. There's this term from a brother called JLC, John Lewis Clark, and he's deaf blind, and he writes about distantism, right? It's almost like a postponement or a throwing away of the immediacy of the world. We kind of throw it away and background it and make it something already done, already finished. I think play is an ecosystem of exploration, and is potentially transformational,
Mm.
right? It is, if our practices look like play, if there is an agenda behind it, if there isn't something to figure out at the end of the day or something to drag the children back to, if it is open-ended, then I feel that is that is a that is being in response to the openness that has already decentralized the human. So
Mm.
me and my kids and I are constantly tumbling into things and wrapping ourselves in. I just, like I said, I had to build a fort before I came to this conversation. Um, and that means re-engineering your perspective. It means re-engineering your location.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
How has your journey with play played out with adults? Do you bring that into working with adults? Have you, and maybe more specifically, have you brought that into any of your online offerings in a way?
Yes. Um, I mean, we will dance with mountains. My course is an invitation to play. Um, I think I describe play as nomadicity recently. Yeah. And the nomad is not the citizen. Like the citizen is stable. The citizen is archived. The citizen is registered, right? You have a passport, you have an ID, you have records, you can be pulled over. The nomad is no such. The nomad passes through, right? The nomad doesn't have identification. The nomad doesn't have records. The nomad is freer, if you will. So play is nomadicity in some kind. It's a passing through. It isn't burdened by notions of ownership. It isn't burdened by notions of citizenry. It isn't burdened by notions of subjectivity that's stable. The nomad is a territory, if you will. And so we are quite excited about examining nomadicity and fugitivity. This is from Black history as play in how it becomes embodied, right? How does activism begin to look like play? Well, post-activism, there's no play without obstacles. When we come to the obstacle, instead of trying to vanquish it, how do we meet it and dance with the intractable, right? So play in politics, play in everything. It's like when you start to see the world from the perspective of motion and movement, that's when play becomes possible. And that's when transformational learning feels like it's gained its own, right? If we're speaking from about transformational learning from the perspective of a stable subject whose behavior changes, and that's merely the case, then I don't know that it isn't repeating the same paradigms of stuckness that we are trying to navigate away from. But if transformational learning looks like an ecology in rapturous conversation with itself, right? If it looks like um, strange alliances, brother, strange alliances, conversations with plants, maybe,
Mhm.
um, like like getting lost in a forest, like um, like exchanging voice, right? Like play that cuts so deep that it leaves us less than human or more than human. That leaves us, it leaves us unlike ourselves. This is what I started with, like shape shifting, right? I remember at one time I invited people to come as aliens to a session.
An
Something so
online
alien that
online session?
online session, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they came with carton boxes and things coming out of their head. And that's play, but that's also disrupting the ways that we understand ourselves and understand the world, right? Culturally, I mean, there are many parts of Europe that had the carnival. Of course, that's now become a party. The carnival was a form of play. It was a way of releasing us from the burden of being ourselves, from
Mm.
the rituals and the roles that we're used to already, and the performativity of the familiar, right? So play was the carnival was an invitation to let go of those roles and to become something else. That is transformational learning for me. It's when we are made, when we're put in touch with the alien,
Mm. There
and
was a
when we're
word
touched. Yeah,
there
yeah.
was a
Go ahead.
word you used earlier that really struck me or stood out for me. You used the word something about awkwardness, you said. And
Yeah,
this is a word that's been rich for me in some ways, and just in the recognition of that which almost every human being struggles to avoid, to appear awkward in public, to feel awkward,
yeah,
that is so central in the structure of life, that everything is these molecules in emergent awkward figuring out how to be in relationship with. And I have found there's a tremendous power in falling into that awkwardness and intentionally landing in that awkwardness to see what emerges. And it kind of lands with me in this territory of play, that the nature of, as soon as play is not awkward, as soon as you're like, here, you put this block and put this block, then it's no longer play, it's
Mm,
it's something
mm,
else.
mm,
The
mm.
nature of play is the freedom of awkwardness.
That's a beautiful way to just think about our conversations so far. It's that a lot of education, a lot of learning is thought of within the prism, or rather not the prism, but the linearity of forward movement. So schools want to go forward. Education is thought of as going forward.
Mm,
Play, if it's not moving forward, think about the temporality of going forward, how that already tracks with ideas of development and ideas of growth and ideas of singularities and ideas of the nation state and its own plans for expansion, unbridled expansionism, right? This going forward seems to get in the way of the way that our bodies do, right? Our bodies are syncopated. Our bodies are written in the lower case, not in the capital, right? We're
mm,
constantly moving from side to side. We don't grow up, we grow sideways, right? So the awkward disrupts the forward movement. The awkward is not in league with my son. I would say the awkward is not a loss of grace, it's the profusion of grace.
mm,
It's when there's excess here. That's why I say that it seems a lot of what we call learning interrupts this excessiveness or tries to contain it. Just in the same way that a PhD, someone doing a PhD knows in their bones that a lot of what passes as knowledge is cut out. Or rather, a lot of what the person wants to bring into expression is cut out because it doesn't fit, right? I remember when I was doing my PhD, for instance, I got told over and over again, this is beautiful writing. This is poetic writing. This is wonderful writing, but it's not the right kind of writing for a PhD, right? I'm moved by it, but I'm not supposed to be moved by it. Like this is what someone on my panel told me.
mm.
I'm so moved by your writing. I'm so caught in with the writing of it. It's so evocative. But that's not what a PhD is supposed to be. It's supposed to be deadening. In my head, I was repeating, I was saying, yeah, right. It's supposed to be deadening. It's supposed to be boring, and it's supposed to be, nothing like what I've written. So, in a sense, we have gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers have been associated with learning. And of course, attaching transformative to um, the same old presuppositions that we're used to, the idea of the learner being the individual, the idea of learning being access to a world that is still. You can see where I'm going with this. It kind of reinforces very problematic tropes about learning and about who we are. So until we disturb the centrality of the human, until we notice what adultism is and how it tries to track and commandeer and instrumentalize play, then um, transformational learning is good for nothing. If it doesn't leave us asunder, if it doesn't break us up to new senses, if it's not some kind of ontological mutiny, if
Mm.
it's not some kind of awkwardness or getting lost or meeting new alliances, if it's not some kind of sensorial apostasy, then I don't know what it is.
I like the ontological mutiny. Um, what would you offer to somebody who is creating a learning experience and has a desire to um, delve into this territory of ontological mutiny in the way that they might share knowledge or understanding about something, and Yeah, and maybe you have a story as well about your own experience in a teaching process.
I would often invite people to follow the track of um, the desirous, of failure, right? And this goes along with my explorations of what I call cracks, right? The crack is when a system or a body loses its integrity, right? It loses its cohesion. But this loss is not a deficit. This loss is an excessiveness. A good example is my door. I think I told you before we began, I'm not sure if I did, but we
Mm.
just gone through a cyclone here in Chennai.
Mm.
And so in fact, my wife just sent me, while we were speaking, a video of a building, just a conference center, or it looked like a shopping mall, flooded all the way to the knees with water, right?
Mm.
So we're going through that. The cyclone is gone now, but we're still dealing with flooding and shaky internet and, you know, janky electricity. But yeah, where was I going with this?
Something about the crack not being a loss of
The cracks, yeah.
integrity.
There you go. So I was talking about my door, and it was raining for 7 days, 8 days, nonstop. And so the furniture in our house has taken all the moisture in the air in, and my door is presently engorged, right? I can't, I don't know that I can see its engorgement with moisture just by looking at it, but I know it's engorged because it's not fitting the frame anymore. I can't barely close it. It's
Mm.
swollen up, right? So that excess is a crack. It's when things don't fit. It's when things lose their instrumentality. Post-activism is basically a vocation of the useless. The door is useless now. And the useless is how play becomes itself, right? If it's instrumental to some end, then it seems that it loses something of itself, right? The useless is the explorational. There's something pragmatic about the useless, in the words of my sister Erin Manning, right? There's something powerful about that. So if I've constantly leaned into the idea of the crack as an invitational space, as the place of tension, as the place of failure, and invited people to explore that in an open-ended way, right? So um, if someone were to design that, I would invite you to consider the disability of design, first of all. That if you could fully articulate it and design it, then be slightly suspicious of it, right? Right. If you can wrap it all neat and tidy and put a line around it, then be suspicious of it, because um, even design is indebted to larger flows, right? And so you want to leave spaces where things are not fully articulated. You want to you want to make certain kinds of invitations, yes, but you also want to leave space where there is no invitation, where people can move freely, and to invite that to actually happen, to invite people to embark on a trail of enlivenment, um, to see what they do in the dark, you know, not as an experiment, not as some perverse kind of experimentation, but a collective experiment with um, with mutiny, with a thing that doesn't fit, feels radically accompanying to me, right? I could give you one example. In the Second World War, after the Second World War, a French philosopher called Fernand Deligny, this is in the 50s and 60s, especially in the 60s, he decided to start a camp for autistic children. See, he was bothered by the fact that the Nazi-led regime that governed France, the Vichy regime, with the regime was throwing kids, autistic and schizophrenic kids, into asylums, and people were dying there. Tens of thousands of people reportedly lost their lives because the conditions were not good for living. And so Deligny drew no distinctions between fascism and psychiatry. And so he decided, let's break the form open. And he basically, like a Pied Piper, led these kids to a very rustic region in the south of France. The aim wasn't to resuscitate, recuperate, heal, or learn from these children as if they were mere objects of study. He didn't try to teach them or heal them. He just wanted to find a way to live with them in community. How do we live with them in a network? What if our language is getting in the way? What if their non-language, so to speak, is actually a gift? What if our language is getting in the way of our sensing other things that the world is doing? This is what I was speaking about, the flows that cannot be languaged. What if that's getting in the way? So they decided to live with them, right? And no one was permitted to speak. It was, let's all not speak together, right? And this camp lasted years, right? They would wash dishes together, they would do stuff together, and after some time, they would trace the kids in their everyday activities, right? Not as a way of representing something to come next, not as a way of drawing maps, but as a way of choreographing the everyday, right? So if the kids went around in circles, where they went, they would trace it. It was a tracing, right? And in one example of this beautiful notion of ontological mutiny as a form of play, they noticed that a certain child would go around in circles at a place where there was underground water that they could not hear. This autistic child was, in a very, very powerful sense, picking up on the rushing springs of water, right, where they could not hear. And so this is how, this is what I mean by sensorial apostasy, that our forms of education are forms of manufacturing subjects, right? And the autistic child seems to be this, not that I'm creating a typology of neurotypicality versus neurodivergence. I think of a single monad stream of neuroemergence, but that's another conversation. But this idea of the autistic child sensing things that are supposedly not present, right, is a powerful way of thinking about framing spaces and networks of play together, right? So notice that he didn't try to fix the problem. He accompanied the problem. It was radical accompaniment. It was radical accompaniment. I will follow you in your desirous adventures. If you go around in a circle, I go around with you in a circle. And that's when they noticed that they had been missing out on stuff. Right? So that's play to me. That's transformational learning, right? Notice it didn't come down to what Deligny as a researcher was picking up. It was the ecology of sensing together that had been forged, that emerged in that moment.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to bring our conversation to a close, but I guess one final reflection
So that
that's
was a
there.
good way to end. Yeah.
One final reflection for me, or just a question, in this context of engagement with the senses, and I'm, and specifically online, which offers an entirely different environment for the senses and the experience of relationship. I'm curious if there's anything specific for you over the last 3-4 years, particularly in a post-COVID world where a lot of things have happened online that have stood out for you as far as um, your experience with creating learning experiences. Anything that's notable for you, as distinct or particularly available or interesting about the online environment as a space for learning.
Um, I've been very excited about, you know, reading about what an author calls digital animism, right? I don't think of the digital as this unnatural thing, which would now give rise to vocations of getting back to the natural, like what it means to be truly human. The
Mhm.
digital is, and no, I don't think of, I think the digital is, just like we are not just local bodies, we are virtual bodies. The digital is a register of the virtual. We are virtual. We are, like I said, we are microplastics on Mount Fuji, right? That's the virtual. You're not just local, you're virtual, you're displaced, you're diasporic. And the digital is just one register of the virtual. So I've been quite reticent about dismissing, in the cadence of it's unnatural. I've been very shy about dismissing the digital spaces, online spaces. I feel that they're very interesting. I feel that you can build depending on how it's framed, one can co-create intimate spaces. You can wash feet online. You can cook together online. We've done it. You can
Mhm.
dance together online. We've tried it. You can sing together online. In fact, the digital provides opportunities that being in person will never provide, will never
Mhm.
offer us, right? So it's not either this or that. I think we need the digital in many senses because um, the stability afforded by white modernity is is widespread and um, it's difficult to approach without learning from afar, if you will. And there's something about the digital that brings the far nearer and closer,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So that's helpful. Having said that, it might, I feel in my body that maybe there are also thresholds here, there are limitations here. And it feels at some level that we are meeting um, some limitation of online spaces that the, regardless of the aspiration to create energetic, animistic, vital online spaces, there are some kind of diminishing return sets in, right? Some paper released by some researchers recently suggests that people are getting tired of Zoom and learning is going down. It's like a bell curve, it's going down. So people are not able to interact with the screen as much as they could in the
Mhm.
heart of the pandemic, right? So I've been telling my people that I think the conference format is dying and it's time for the carnival.
Mhm.
There are other things that need to be practiced or put into practice um, that the digital doesn't know how to hold space for. We want to dig our hands in dirt. We need not just a pedagogical, we need a para-pedagogical. Again, Erin Manning, a very close sister. I've invoked her 3 times now because her learnings and teachings and readings are very important, I feel. We need the para-ontological. We need to travel differently. Our bodies want to do other things and take on new postures other than
Mhm.
this posture
Mhm.
that is that is imperative when we are with the digital. So seemingly so. So I think the carnival is needed. The conference is not, I'm not dismissing it, but I think it needs at least supplementation of some kind. It needs other kinds of convening intelligences. And that's what I'm exploring right now with my people.
Hmm. In the world of online, what's the distinction between carnival and conference?
I mean, with the carnival, smells are possible. You're breathing the same air with the people that you're looking at face to face. You're touching skins or rubbing against skin. There's a sense of um, the gathering that is possible with the carnival that is not possible with the digital, right?
Hmm.
There, I can, the front facing thing where, and I'm not saying intimacy is not possible in digital spaces. I cannot claim that because, yeah, just as I cannot claim that human beings own cognition. I think in a time of AI, you know, cognition has never been human. I think it's possible to say it's traveling, right? It's not ours to own. So I'm not going to dismiss the digital. I haven't done that. I will never do that. I think um, the carnival presents new kinds of sensorial intelligences that do
Hmm.
not reduce to
Hmm.
instruction or is not limited to fixed times or and there's something just just possible in when you're close to another body,
Hmm.
yeah, that is maybe missing with the digital. Yeah.
Mm. I love that new kinds of sensorial experiences.
Yeah.
You mentioned the author Digital Animism. Do you know the author's name?
No, I cannot I will let me just get it on my phone. I think it's one of the things that I'm really reading now at the moment. Digital. Yeah, there you go. I found it. It's called Digital Animism Towards a New Materialism. Victor J. Krebs. Krebs. Victor J. Krebs.
Hmm.
It's not a book, it's an article. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bayo, thank you for taking the
Thank you.
time to share your wisdom, and I really appreciate the richness of the territory that we have covered today. So much
Thank
gratitude
you.
to you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. Thank you.